Welcome to another video of Biographies of Immortal Beings. Today, we will talk about the life of Francisco Franco, the dictator who divided Spain forever. In the misty mountains of Galicia, a child was born who would change Spain's destiny forever. Francisco Franco Bahamonde came into the world on December 4, 1892 in El Ferrol, son of an alcoholic naval officer and a deeply religious mother. His childhood was marked by paternal absence and maternal rigor, forging a cold and calculating character that would define his future. The family home echoed with prayers and reproaches. Nicolás Franco, his father, preferred taverns to his home. Pilar Bahamonde, his mother, compensated for the masculine absence with an obsessive religious devotion that would forever mark Francisco's worldview. The little boy learned early that life was struggle, that the weak succumbed and only the strong survived. Among siblings, Francisco stood out for his reserved but relentless temperament. His playmates already sensed something different in those cold eyes. At 14 years old, Franco entered the Toledo Infantry Academy, where he excelled through iron discipline and boundless ambition. He was small in stature, but giant in determination. His classmates nicknamed him the Dwarf, unaware that this shy young man would become Europe's longest-lasting dictator. Early 20th century Spain was boiling with crisis, and Franco absorbed every lesson like a sponge thirsty for power and recognition. Toledo's centuries-old walls witnessed the transformation of the shy Galician into a ruthless military man. Franco studied obsessively: strategy, military history, geography. While other cadets had fun, he memorized Napoleonic battles and analyzed Prussian tactics. His instructors noticed something special: a calculated coldness that turned every exercise into a survival lesson. Spain needed soldiers, but was forging its future executioner. In 1912, barely 20 years old, Franco requested assignment to Morocco, where Spain maintained a bloody protectorate. There, among the Rif sands and rebel tribe gunfire, the ruthless military man was born. He rose meteorically. Commander at 23, lieutenant colonel at 25. His soldiers both feared and respected him. He was brave to the point of recklessness, but calculating like a chess player who sees 10 moves ahead. The Rif Mountains became the laboratory where Franco experimented with absolute power. He commanded colonial troops brutalized by war: Moors, legionnaires, unscrupulous mercenaries. He learned that fear was more effective than love, that systematic cruelty broke any resistance. His methods were questionable, his results undeniable. The Riffians learned to fear the small general who knew no mercy. The Rif Wars were his university of horror. Franco learned that systematic cruelty could be more effective than blind courage. He employed brutal tactics against the Riffians, including the use of toxic gases banned by international conventions. His methods were questionable, but his results undeniable. At 33 years old, he became Europe's youngest general. Spain had created a military monster without knowing it yet. Abd el-Krim, the Riffian leader, knew Franco's reputation: relentless, efficient, without moral scruples. Berber populations whispered about the Spanish general who razed entire villages to break resistance. Franco perfected psychological warfare, a mixture of calculated terror and propaganda that destroys enemy morale before their weapons do. Morocco taught him that governing was, essentially, dominating. In 1923, he returned to a convulsed Spain. Primo de Rivera's dictatorship welcomed him as a hero, but Franco had already learned the most important lesson: political power surpassed military power. He observed, waited, calculated. When the Second Republic arrived in 1931, Franco remained apparently loyal, but inside he despised the democratic chaos he saw in the streets. His moment was approaching inexorably like a storm. The Second Republic awakened his darkest instincts. Franco watched with horror as the military lost prestige, how the church was attacked, how traditional social order crumbled. The Asturias Revolution in 1934 gave him the perfect opportunity. He led a brutal repression that left thousands dead and detained. The Asturian miners learned that Franco didn't distinguish between combatants and civilians when it came to preserving order. Carmen Polo, his wife since 1923, knew Francisco's cold soul better than anyone. She had seen him transform from the shy young officer into the ruthless general. Carmen was his confidant, his advisor, his silent accomplice. Together, they formed a perfect couple for power. He was calculating and brutal, she aristocratic and ambitious. Their daughter Nanuka would grow up seeing how absolute power corrupts even the most intimate bonds. On July 17, 1936, Spain awoke divided forever. The military uprising against the Republic had begun, and Franco, from the Canary Islands, joined the coup. But what should have been a quick pronunciation became a devastating civil war. Franco demonstrated his political genius. While other generals died or failed, he consolidated power in the nationalist zone with the patience of a snake waiting for the exact moment to strike. The first months of war were crucial. Franco played his cards masterfully. While Sanjurjo died in a plane crash and Mola perished mysteriously, he rose as the undisputed leader of the national side. Some whisper that the accidents weren't coincidental. Franco had learned in Morocco that in war, as in politics, scruples are a luxury winners can't afford. Eliminating rivals was simple survival. The Civil War was Franco's baptism of fire as absolute leader. With Nazi and Italian help, he systematically crushed the Republic. He bombed Guernica, executed prisoners, purified conquered territories with chilling administrative meticulousness. It wasn't just a military war, but an ideological crusade. Franco erected himself as savior of Catholic and traditional Spain against godless communism. The price? 500,000 dead and a destroyed country. Guernica burned on April 26, 1937. German bombers from the Condor Legion razed the sacred city of the Basques, while Franco watched impassively. It wasn't just aerial terrorism, it was a message. Any resistance would be crushed without mercy. Guernica survivors would remember all their lives the roar of the Junkers and the smell of burned flesh. Franco had crossed a moral line from which he would never return. The repression in the nationalist rearguard was systematic and brutal. Franco established military tribunals that functioned like killing machines, summary trials, predetermined sentences, mass executions. Teachers, unionists, intellectuals, anyone suspected of Republican sympathies was eliminated. Spain's ditches filled with anonymous corpses. Franco built his new order on a mountain of bones that Spain would take decades to acknowledge. On April 1, 1939, Franco proclaimed total victory from Burgos. Spain lay in ruins, but he rose as the undisputed caudillo. He established an iron dictatorship based on three pillars: integralist Catholicism, Spanish nationalism, and visceral anti-communism. There would be no forgiveness or reconciliation. The vanquished would be systematically humiliated, persecuted, exterminated. Franco's Spain was born on a sea of blood, tears, and terror, that would last 4 decades. Madrid's victory parade was apotheotic. Franco, mounted on his white horse, rode through the streets while crowds cheered him. But behind the forced smiles hid fear. Madrid had resisted 3 years. Now it would pay for its insolence. Prisons filled up, execution walls worked day and night. Franco had promised order, and he would impose it even if he had to turn Spain into a silent cemetery. The 1940s were years of iron and blood in Spain. Franco built a relentless police state where every citizen was a potential suspect. The civil guard, armed police, and secret services watched every corner, every conversation, every gesture. Tens of thousands of Republicans were executed or died in prison. Families learned to speak in whispers, to distrust even their shadows. Fear became the regime's cement. The Valley of the Fallen was built with slave labor from political prisoners who died by the hundreds excavating the mountain. Franco conceived the monument as a symbol of his eternal victory, an underground basilica crowned by a 150-meter cross. Republican prisoners carved their own humiliation in granite while their families starved. It was the perfect metaphor for Francoism, grandeur built on others' suffering. Economic autarky plunged Spain into absolute misery. Rationing cards, black market, and hunger defined the 1940s. Franco promised imperial grandeur, but Spain regressed decades in time. Thousands of Spaniards crossed the Pyrenees seeking bread. Their homeland denied them. The caudillo lived in El Pardo like a Roman emperor, while his people bled in silence and desperation. The children of the 1940s grew up between rationing cards and endless lines. Oil, sugar, meat were unattainable luxuries for most. Spanish mothers learned to cook miracles with lentils and potatoes, while Franco banqueted in El Pardo with imported delicacies. Imperial Spain fed on gruel and broken dreams. The contrast between grandiose rhetoric and miserable reality was obscene. The 1950s marked a crucial turn in the dictatorship. The Cold War converted anti-communist Franco into a valuable ally for the United States. The 1953 Pax brought American military bases and economic aid that began pulling Spain from the medieval pit it had fallen into. Franco had played his cards perfectly again, from international pariah to strategic partner. Spain began to breathe, but the price was perpetuating its isolation. Eisenhower visited Madrid in 1959, internationally legitimizing the regime. Franco received the American president as an equal, strolling through Madrid's streets among organized applause. For the caudillo, it was the definitive triumph. The United States, leader of the free world, was shaking his blood-stained hand. Republican exiles watched in horror as their hopes for liberation vanished in the name of Cold War realpolitik. The 1960s economic miracle radically transformed Spain. European tourism discovered Spanish coasts, emigrant remittances filled family coffers, and industrialization pulled the country from secular backwardness. But Franco kept his absolute power intact, like a pharaoh presiding over Egypt's modernization. Economic prosperity paradoxically coexisted with the harshest political repression. Spain progressed materially while remaining anchored in the political Middle Ages. The 600s began filling Spanish roads, symbol of unimaginable prosperity from a decade before. Spaniards discovered consumption, paid vacations, appliances. But beneath the surface of well-being, tension boiled. ETA began its armed struggle in the Basque Country, worker strikes multiplied, and university students challenged the regime. Franco aged clinging to power while Spain awakened from its lethargy. May 68 shook Europe, but Spain remained shielded by censorship and repression. Complutense students tried to imitate their Parisian counterparts, but Francoist police weren't the French gendarmerie. Demonstrations were crushed with brutality reminiscent of the dictatorship's worst moments. Franco observed from El Pardo how Europe changed while he kept Spain frozen in time like a relic of the past. Carrero Blanco, Franco's heir apparent, represented regime continuity beyond the dictator's death. But on December 20th, 1973, ETA blew up the admiral's car in central Madrid, turning succession into an unsolvable problem. Franco lost his political heir, and Spain was left rudderless. The Claudio Coelho street attack marked Francoism's beginning of the end. Without Carrero, there was no Francoism without Franco. Franco's last years were agonizing for all of Spain. The Burgos trial against ETA militants, the execution of 5 anti-Franco activists in September 1975, the succession crisis. The dictator aged, clinging to power while Europe viewed him as a bloody anachronism. Juan Carlos, the designated prince, waited patiently for his moment. Franco had built a regime tailored to himself, but personalist regimes inevitably die with their creators. Francoism's last executions in September 1975 provoked an unprecedented diplomatic crisis. Europe withdrew its ambassadors, protest demonstrations filled Western capitals, and Spain was more isolated than ever. Franco, already gravely ill, had given his final swipe, but the cost was terrible. Spain entered democratic transition marked by the blood of the regime's last executed victims. On October 30th, 1975, Franco suffered a heart attack that marked the beginning of his final agony. For 3 weeks, Spain held its breath while the dictator fought death at La Paz Hospital. Doctors artificially prolonged his life, while politicians prepared for the inevitable change. Carmen Polo kept vigil beside the bed, clinging to the last vestiges of power that had defined her existence for 4 decades. On November 20th, 1975, at 5:25 in the morning, Francisco Franco died after an interminable agony. Spain held its breath. What would come after 39 years of dictatorship? Streets remained silent, but in hearts stirred a hope contained for decades. The caudillo had died, but his shadow would continue projecting over Spain for generations, like a wound that would take decades to heal completely. Franco's funeral was the regime's last great spectacle. Heads of state from half the world paraded before his coffin, from Pinochet to Arab representatives, passing through dignitaries from African dictatorships. Democratic Europe was conspicuously absent. The Valley of the Fallen received the dictator's remains in a grandiose but anachronistic ceremony. Spain buried Franco, but couldn't bury his legacy. Franco left a profoundly divided Spain, those who adored him as savior of the homeland, and those who execrated him as a bloodthirsty tyrant. He had economically modernized the country, but kept it in the political Middle Ages for 4 decades. His legacy endures today. Unopened mass graves, confronted memories, unhealed family wounds. Spain learned that dictatorship can be efficient, but always exacts a terrible price in freedom and dignity. The Spanish transition was, in many ways, a settling of accounts with Francoism. Juan Carlos, educated by Franco to perpetuate the regime, chose to gradually dismantle it. It was an exemplary transition, but also an amnesiac one. Francoism's crimes were buried under the pact of silence. Spain chose the future over justice, reconciliation over revenge, but unhealed wounds would continue festering for decades. The children of the vanquished grew up hearing whispers about executed grandfathers, about mass graves, about terror. The children of the victors inherited the myth of the savior caudillo. Two Spains continued coexisting after Franco, one that remembered with nostalgia the years of peace and prosperity, another that couldn't forget the ditches full of bones. The dictator had died, but his ghost continued dividing Spaniards. Franco's figure remains controversial 4 decades after his death. For some, he was the dictator who sank Spain into backwardness and terror. For others, the statesman who saved the country from communism and modernized it. Truth, as always, is more complex. Franco was both things and neither. He was his time's product, but also its molder. A small man who cast a gigantic shadow over Spain's history. In 2019, Franco's remains were exhumed from the Valley of the Fallen and transferred to Mingarubio Cemetery, symbolically closing a painful chapter in Spanish history. But debate over his legacy continues. Was he a bloodthirsty dictator or an authoritarian statesman? An unscrupulous opportunist? Or a convinced patriot? The answers continue dividing Spaniards, proof that Franco, dead for decades, remains a living character in collective memory. Franco's childhood in El Ferrol was marked by silenced domestic violence. His father, Nicolas, didn't just drink, he beat. Nights resonated with muffled screams and door slams that Francisco memorized as power lessons. Pilar, his mother, prayed after each beating, converting pain into Christian sacrifice. Little Francisco learned that the strong dominate, the weak suffer, and that God, apparently, blesses the former. These childhood lessons would forge the future dictator, be academic. German instructors, hired to modernize the Spanish army, taught Prussian discipline, blind obedience, immediate punishment, unbreakable hierarchy. Franco absorbed these lessons with religious fanaticism. While other cadets protested harsh methods, he asked for more. Instructors noted his thirst for domination. This small Galician had the makings of Führerprinzip, the principle of absolute leadership that Germany exported throughout Europe. Freemasonry obsessed Franco with sick paranoia. He saw Masonic lodges behind every conspiracy, every opposition to his power. His anti-Masonic stance wasn't just political, it was personal. Franco sincerely believed that a worldwide Judeo-Masonic conspiracy was trying to destroy Spain. This obsession led him to create detailed files on supposed Masons, most imaginary. Thousands of Spaniards were persecuted because of this paranoia. Franco's mind converted his personal fears into systematic and lethal state policy. El Pardo's bunker became the nerve center of Francoist terror. Franco worked in an armored office surrounded by maps showing the location of every political prisoner, every exile, every subversive element. He received daily reports on tortures, executions, disappearances. He read them while having breakfast, with the same tranquility others read newspapers. For Franco, repression wasn't an unpleasant necessity, it was the art of governing. Fear was his most precious tool. Carmen Franco developed a court of flatterers that rivaled Versailles in servility. She called herself Her Excellency the Lady and demanded bows from ministers and generals. She organized receptions where hierarchs' wives competed in praise of the regime. Carmen had discovered that power corrupts, but also that the wife of power can corrupt even more. While Franco killed in public, Carmen destroyed reputations in private salons. The perfect marriage for a perfect dictator. Franco's obsession with protocol bordered on pathological. Every public appearance was choreographed to the millimeter. The exact height of the platform, the angle of flags, the precise duration of applause. Franco understood that dictatorships are sustained as much by terror as by theatricality. Every ceremony was a message. I control even the last detail of your existence. Spaniards learned to applaud with the exact intensity that wouldn't arouse suspicion, neither too little nor too much. Franco's education converted millions of children into little inquisitors. In schools, they were taught to denounce red parents, Masonic teachers, subversive neighbors. Children competed to be the most efficient informers. Franco had understood the definitive totalitarian lesson. If he corrupted children, he would have submissive adults. An entire generation grew up believing that spying and denouncing was patriotic. Francoism didn't just dominate bodies, it colonized children's souls that would take decades to heal. Franco's last days were grotesque, kept artificially alive by machines, his body decomposed while doctors invented optimistic medical bulletins. Carmen refused to accept his death, convinced that God couldn't abandon the caudillo by grace of God. Regime hierarchs organized secret meetings to divide post-Franco power. Spain held its breath, waiting for the agony to end. The dictator who had caused so much suffering was finally suffering. But Spain suffered with him, waiting for a dawn that seemed never to come. Franquist censorship was more subtle and perverse than Nazi or Soviet. Franco didn't ban books, he mutilated them. Censors ripped out pages, crossed out paragraphs, rewrote endings. Cervantes was censored as subversive, Lorca erased from history, Garcia Marquez banned as communist. But Franco allowed certain inoffensive culture to appear normal. The result? Entire generations grew up with lobotomized culture, not knowing what had been stolen from them. Organized ignorance as state policy. The Catholic Church was Francoism's sacred prostitute. Cardinal Goma blessed the bombings. Pius XV legitimized the dictatorship. Spanish bishops converted pulpits into political platforms. Franco declared himself sword of Christianity while torturing in convent basements. The church received medieval privileges, monopolized education, banned civil marriage, non-existent divorce. Christ was kidnapped by a dictator who blasphemed in his name daily. The cross and sword united in a macabre dance. Catalonia suffered genocidal cultural repression. Franco banned Catalan in schools, churches, mass media. Catalan names were Castilianized by decree. Josep became José. Montserrat became Montserrat. Sardanas were prohibited. Castellers persecuted. The señora replaced by the Spanish flag. Franco understood that killing a language was killing a people without shedding blood. Catalonia resisted underground. Keeping its soul alive in whispers Franco never managed to completely silence. Euskera, Europe's oldest language, almost died under Franco. Basque children were physically punished for speaking their mother tongue. ETA was born in part from this systematic cultural aggression. Basque surnames were Hispanicized. Echevarria became Echevarria. Aguirre became Aguirre. Franco believed that eliminating regional languages would create a uniform Spain. He only succeeded in sowing resentments that would explode decades after his death. Basque survived, but forever marked by persecution. Galicia, Franco's birthland, suffered the most painful betrayal. Galician was banned by its own most famous son. Pilgrimages were watched, folk songs censored, Galician literature buried. Franco was ashamed of his rural origins and systematically avenged himself on them. Rosalia de Castro was banned, Castelao exiled, Galician culture reduced to tourist folklore. The prodigal son had returned home to murder his cultural mother, the most perfect betrayal in Spanish history. 1960s, developmentalism was the great Francoist deception. Opus Dei technocrats sold economic prosperity as political legitimation. First eat, then vote, they said. Spaniards accepted the Faustian Pact, material wealth in exchange for political freedom, beaches filled with tourists, factories with workers, banks with foreign currency. But beneath the veneer of well-being, repression continued implacably. Franco had discovered the perfect formula: bread and circuses without freedom, fascism with a prosperous face. The Greys became the symbol of everyday Francoist terror. The armed police patrolled streets in their leaden uniforms, batons at their belts, icy gazes. Any gathering of more than 3 people was suspicious. Students feared them, workers hated them, mothers cursed them silently. The Greys weren't just police, they were fear materialized, the visible incarnation of a state that distrusted its own citizens. Franco had turned Spain into a prison Francoist. Prisons were laboratories of psychological horror. They didn't just torture bodies, they destroyed souls. Political prisoners were forced to hear Mass, shout, "Long live Franco," publicly renounce their ideas. Women prisoners suffered specific humiliations: shaved heads, forced castor oil, systematic rapes. Franco had perfected torture. It wasn't enough to break physical resistance. Human dignity had to be annihilated. Prisons were factories of dead souls. Republican exile was a bleeding wound in the Spanish soul. 500,000 Spaniards crossed the Pyrenees in 1939, many never to return. France locked them in concentration camps. Some ended up in Nazi ovens. Exiles founded an invisible Spain, restaurants in Paris, newspapers in Mexico, gatherings in Buenos Aires. Franco stole their homeland, but they kept democratic Spain alive in exile. 2 Spains separated by a border of blood and silence. The 13 roses symbolized Francoist cruelty against women. 13 young Republican women, some minors, were shot in August 1939 for resisting the regime. Their crimes: distributing flyers, singing Republican songs, keeping hope alive. Franco had them executed as a warning. Women who dared challenge patriarchal order would be annihilated without mercy. The 13 roses became symbols of a generation of women who preferred to die standing rather than live on their knees. The Blue Division was the price Franco paid Hitler for staying neutral. 35,000 Spanish volunteers left for Russia to fight Bolshevism. Officially, Spain wasn't at war. Unofficially, Spanish blood watered Russian steppes. Franco played all cards. If Hitler won, Spain would have participated in victory. If he lost, it would have been just a voluntary contribution. 10,000 Spaniards died on the Russian front, sacrificed on the altar of Francoist political ambiguity. The 13 roses symbolized Francoist cruelty against women. 13 young Republican women, some minors, were shot in August 1939 for resisting the regime. Their crimes: distributing flyers, singing Republican songs, keeping hope alive. Franco had them executed as a warning. Women who dared challenge patriarchal order would be annihilated without mercy. The 13 roses became symbols of a generation of women who preferred to die standing rather than live on their knees. No Do, the official newsreel, was Francoism's most effective propaganda machine. For 40 years, all Spaniards saw the same version of reality: Franco inaugurating dams, blessing harvests, receiving ovations. It was mandatory to screen before every film. Reality filtered through the Francoist prism. Strikes became labor misunderstandings. Opposition became disturbing elements. Franco understood that controlling information meant controlling minds. No do was his Orwellian ministry of truth. Francoist autarky condemned Spain to technological backwardness. While Europe rebuilt with the Marshall Plan, Spain lived with its back to progress. Spanish cars were primitive copies of foreign models. Industry functioned with obsolete machinery. Agriculture remained medieval. Franco believed isolation would protect Spanish essence from foreign influences. He only succeeded in turning Spain into a museum of underdevelopment. Autarky was the price of arrogance. Franco preferred his own poverty to others' prosperity. Francoist courage mothers searched for their disappeared children with dignity that defied the regime. Dressed in rigorous black, they toured police stations, prisons, cemeteries. Franco tolerated them because they embodied Catholic maternal suffering that his propaganda exalted. But these women were unknowingly subversive. Their silent pain accused the regime more than any clandestine pamphlet. Some never found their children. Others found them in mass graves decades later. Their pain was the most terrible accusation against Franco. The 1953 Concordat turned Spain into a de facto theocratic state. The Vatican legitimized the dictatorship in exchange for medieval privileges, mandatory canonical marriage, monopolized religious education, banned divorce. Franco declared himself defender of Christianity, while torture dungeon basements echoed with screams. The church closed its eyes to horror in exchange for temporal power. It was Spanish history's most cynical alliance, the cross blessing the bloodied sword. 1968 students broke generational silence. Francoism's children discovered that Europe had changed while Spain remained frozen. Universities became seedbeds of dissidents, clandestine assemblies, banned flyers, repressed protests. Franco responded by closing universities and imprisoning students. But it was too late. An entire generation had lost its fear. Young people who had grown up in economic prosperity also demanded political prosperity. Francoism began dying from generational asphyxiation. Workers' Commissions was born in Francoism's industrial entrails. Workers discovered they could organize within the regime's vertical unions, subverting them from within. Marcelino Camacho became the symbol of a working class that no longer accepted being Francoism's folkloric decoration. Strikes multiplied. Metal workers in Madrid, miners in Asturias, construction in Catalonia. Franco had created a modern working class that rebelled against its creator. Developmentalism bred its own gravediggers. American bases turned Spain into a Western aircraft carrier against communism. In exchange, the United States closed its eyes to Francoist repression. American dollars modernized Spain, but also prolonged the dictatorship. Franco had perfectly played the Cold War card. His visceral anti-communism made him a valuable ally for Washington. Republican exiles watched bitterly as American democracy embraced their executioner. Realpolitik triumphed over human rights. Franco had found his international lifeline. 1960s tourism changed Spain more than any political revolution. Millions of Europeans discovered Spanish coasts, bringing customs, ideas, freedoms that brutally contrasted with official Spain. Beaches filled with bikinis that scandalized Catholic morality, bars with conversations in forbidden languages, discos with censored music. Franco tolerated this invasion because it brought currency, but didn't calculate it would also bring ideas. Tourism was modernity's Trojan horse in Europe. Mass emigration bled Spanish villages dry. 2 million Spaniards went to Europe seeking work their homeland denied them. From Galicia to Andalusia, entire villages were inhabited only by elderly and children. Emigrants sent remittances that sustained the Francoist economy, but also letters describing European freedom. Franco exported Spaniards, and they imported democratic ideas. Emigration became an informal school of freedom. Spaniards learned in Germany and France what Spain forbade them. If you liked this video, don't hesitate to subscribe, give it a like, and share it. This is Biographies of Immortal Beings. See you in the next video.